Hi, David and Patrick.
Hey.
Good to see you guys. So I am the features director of The New Yorker, and I've been lucky to work with David and Patrick, two of the magazine's most creative staff writers for years. And sometimes they try to go on the straight and narrow and write about, say Anthony Bourdain or an adventurer who walks across Antarctica, but inevitably they get lured back to the life of crime writing. And I tell myself this is because of the narrative possibilities, the opportunities for guiding readers down hairpin turns, or the ability to explore complex moral questions, and not because of some morbid compulsion. Whatever their reasons, though, they are masters at taking a genre that could be merely lurid and twisting it into something fresh and emotionally rich. Let me introduce David Grann. At The New Yorker, he's written about everything from a serial impersonator to a Sherlock Holmes scholar who died under mysterious circumstances with a rope around his neck. David is the author of two brilliantly seductive books. The Lost City of Z tells of an Edwardian explorer, Percy Fawcett, who, unfortunately for the purposes of this panel, wasn't a criminal, unless you want to judge him for taking his own son on a doomed journey into the Amazon. Killers of the Flower Moon, however, fits the theme. It will soon become a Martin Scorsese film, and it chronicles a wave of murders that befell the Osage tribe in Oklahoma in the 1920s after the land beneath their feet turned out to be filled with oil. David is now at work on a book about, I guess I'll give you a one-word teaser, a mutiny. Perhaps the most notorious criminal that Patrick Keefe has written about for The New Yorker is El Chapo, the murderous drug lord whose escape from prison in a bespoke tunnel has become one of the most famous getaways in crime history. But many of the rogues in Patrick's gallery are not outlaws, but rather corrupt insiders, stock traders, wine fraudsters, profiteering Trump advisors, men whose empires are built on bribes. He's the author of several books, including The Snakehead, the story of Sister Ping, a human smuggler whose empire ended after a fatal accident, and Say Nothing, a panoramic history of the troubles in Northern Ireland, in which along the way, he solves a murder case that eluded the authorities for decades. That's a side thing that both Patrick and David do, finishing jobs for the police. Patrick has a new podcast, Winds of Change, which is about a side thing that the CIA may be engaged in, which is writing pop songs as propaganda. He is also working on a book about the Sackler family and the selling of OxyContin. All right, so let's talk. Both of your most recent books, Say Nothing and Flower Moon, they're panoramic historical tales that are anchored by the murders of women. In Patrick's book, Jean McConville, a mother of 10 in Belfast, is kidnapped from her apartment by the IRA and never returns. And in Flower Moon, an Osage woman named Anna Brown goes out for a night and never comes back. In some ways, like the story of the discovery of oil in America and its corruption, or the political drama of Northern Ireland, they didn't have to be framed as true crime tales. What made you guys frame these stories in that way?
Want to go first, Patrick?
Yeah.
You first, please.
So, to understand what was happening, which is for the book Colors of the Flower Moon, which was about how the Osage Nation in Oklahoma had become the wealthiest people per capita in the world because of oil under their land. And then they began to be serially murdered. To understand the broader themes and the systemic corruption and the systems of evil, you really needed to understand what was happening to the actual people. And that took you into the heart of this one woman I wrote about, Molly Burkhart, whose family one by one is being murdered. And I wanted as much as possible to get her perspective, in part because it had been ignored in history because she was a woman and because she was Osage, but also so that the readers could understand what it was actually like, what it felt like, what the experience was like to have your sister go out and not come back. And then within a span of 2 months, to have your mother be poisoned and died. And then to have a younger sister who's so afraid she moves closer to town to be near you. And then one night at 3 in the morning, you hear this explosion and you go to your window and you look out and you see this red ball rising to the sky, and you realize that somebody had planted a bomb underneath your younger sister's house, killing her as well. And so by trying to close the lens or the scope in a way to make it how it was felt personally and individually, I thought was so important, so that you actually really felt what was happening. And also you understood as much as possible from the records, the Osage point of view.
Did you know, how long did it take you to figure out that Molly and her experience of kind of growing paranoia and confirmation that something sinister was afoot, that was the way into the story? You know, a different writer might have said, I'm just going to begin with an actual straightforward chronicle of a murder. I'm going to like let you know what happened. But instead, the reader is actually kind of usefully confused at first in the same way that Molly is about what's happening around her.
Yeah. So I thought for two things. One, you know, as a writer who deals with fact and facticity, and I think in true crime, the burden of being factual and being morally conscious about the facticity of what you write is really heightened. Part of it was there was a lot of underlying documentations dealing with those crimes. There were multiple investigations, so I could access that record. But also, I think it's really important when you tell these stories so that the reader can experience them the way they unfolded. And that is to see them from the point of view of people experiencing them, not with hindsight, not with all the knowledge we have looking back with 70 years, but what it was like to be in that bewildered experience when you are not sure who is plotting against you, who may be the next victim, and you yourself are thrust into the role of being an investigator in a world that is murky and in which people are covering up the evidence. So all of that kind of made it, I don't want to say the obvious choice, but all that led me to that choice and that decision to begin the book with her.
Patrick, was Say Nothing inspired by your discovery of the murder of McConville, or did you find about her story through another way and then realize that it was an excellent way to tell the story of young people who had passionate views about Northern Ireland, and then before they knew it, they were committing acts that would haunt them for the rest of their lives?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't start with the murder. I didn't start with Jean McConville. I actually started with an obituary of this woman, Dolores Price, who's a big figure in the book. And actually the obituary mentioned that there was this woman, Jean McConville, who had been this mother of 10 who'd been abducted and murdered in 1972, and suggested that Dolores Price, who as a young woman was the first sort of real full-fledged member of the IRA to be a woman, that she might have played some role in this. So there was always this idea of connecting those two stories. It's funny hearing David talk. I mean, I feel as though as a writer, I came of age as a parishioner in the Church of David Grann. So I mean, I would repeat a lot of what he said, but of course I would. This question of aperture. I mean, I think often, I think about genre a lot and about genre conventions and the ways in which, if there's a complex story, sometimes it can be tough to get people to read a 10,000 word magazine article about it. And so for me, if there is the kind of comforting familiarity, even if it's a little misleading, of some genre conventions, that you can kind of coax somebody into the story with a bit of a mystery, it allows you to take a certain kind of reader who, normally if you ask them, hey, would you want to read an article or a book about the Troubles, would say, I just don't have time. And hopefully engage them in that story. But again, to David's point, because when you do it right, there's a way of telling the history in a very kind of intimate manner, so that you're in these people's heads, you're in their homes, you're in their thoughts. And I find as a reader and also as a writer that level of identification is helpful. With Say Nothing specifically, there was an added appeal to telling the story in that way, which is that I was just very interested in the long-term second and third order consequences of violence. And I thought that if you could focus on a single act of violence and look at the impact it had on the victims. So in this case, Jean McConville, but also her children, but also on the perpetrators, the people who were involved, and kind of trace those ripples over time, that you might be able to say something interesting about what happens in conflicts like this. But the only way for me to do that would it wouldn't have worked, I don't think, or I couldn't have made it work in a 30,000 foot sort of diagnostic view. I needed to be on the ground with those people, hopefully experiencing it as they did.
Mm-hmm. I think, and part of that came, when I went and read when I read the little that had been written about the Osage cases, or, it often was just a cataloging of the dead. And you had no idea what their lives were like, what happened to them, the effects of trauma. One of the reasons we write about crime is not to titillate, but to hopefully expose elements of character, but also these larger themes that Patrick does so well in Say Nothing, about systemic violence, culture of violence, the lasting effects of trauma. And just one thing that Patrick said that I thought was really interesting is that, crime stories fit into certain patterns of genre, the way kind of these stories have been told over and over again in many ways. And you can use those elements. But then what was interesting with, for example, with Killers of the Flower Moon is, it begins with these crimes, and then it also brings in investigators who are trying to unravel the crime. But the last third of the book, because it's real life, completely subverts the genre, which is, as I began to investigate the case, I originally thought of it as a kind of traditional crime story, which is that there were these murders that were perpetrated by a singular evil figure with a few henchmen, and then kind of law enforcement came in and cleaned it up. It kind of fit this kind of mythic genre pattern. And then as I began to speak to more Osage and gather more evidence and go to the archives, I began to realize that that really wasn't true, that this was this culture of killing, that there were many people complicit, there were prosecutors complicit, there were doctors giving poisons. It was basically societal. And there was also a great deal of doubt where many of these crimes were unresolved. And so part of the horror for me in researching the story was that these elements basically unravel, and there really isn't that resolution because that's real life.
Mm-hmm. Looking at your bookshelf, Patrick, behind you, I'm sure there's many high literary works, but both of you guys, I imagine, kind of schooled yourself in part on, some Pulp Fiction. Like I know David, your mom, among other things, like edited Tom Clancy, and there's a kind of world of sort of, reading books in that kind of hungry way that a certain kind of, airport thriller can provide. Do you guys still read those kinds of books daily, for inspiration? And how do you think of the connection between the kinds of, tropes that you find in a kind of good thriller and your own work? And is there ever a line where you say, I don't think I should do the same manipulative thing that I see in this, mystery novel because it's going too far?
You want to go, Patrick?
After you, sir.
They were certainly the first books that I read. I mean, I used to read The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes when I was young. My mom was an editor and a publisher, and she published Dick Francis and Agatha Christie's Backlog. And so those were a lot of the first books I grew up reading. And to this day, they are still what I read for pleasure. I don't know. They probably inform you in subtle ways. I think kind of reading widely and reading everything informs you, but they don't always have to be about crimes. For example, sometimes the connections are so subtle and almost unconscious, the way it can influence your work. When I was working on Killers of the Flower Moon, I was completely baffled on how to structure the book, because even though I begin with Molly Burkhart, there were so many individuals involved, there were so many murders, there were so many investigators, and not one person spanned the whole narrative. And I was reading Adslom by Faulkner, because I read a story in the New York Times Magazine, and I was like, oh, I never read that book. And for any of you out there who've read it, it's a good book to read in the pandemic. Very hard to read, very slow. I'm not sure if I still fully understood it, but when I was reading it, I realized it was told from three narrators, 3 points of view, and it dealt with the kind of elliptical quality of history and the unreliability of history. And when I was totally stuck on my book and I was reading that book, I suddenly was literally like at 11:30 at night, and I turned to my wife and I said, that's it. 3 people. I could tell the story from 3 people. That way I can keep the story intimate, but I can tell it from each vantage point. And only with each vantage point do you start to get a broader rest. So I find that books influence you in ways. And for nonfiction true crime, I often think of true crime in different ways. So I think of like All the President's Men as like a classic true crime book. In other words, it doesn't have to be what we always think of, like In Cold Blood.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm probably similar. I don't read that much genre fiction now. I read a lot when I was growing up. In some ways, I almost maxed out when I was growing up. But I read a lot of Agatha Christie. I loved P.D. James. And there are certain books that had a huge impact on me. I remember very vividly reading Presumed Innocent by Scott Turow, and what he was doing in that book, where it had qualities of a literary novel, the characterization and the sense of place and the sentences were beautiful. I mean, Richard Price is this way too, where there are these kind of genre plot conventions, but there's also it's not stock characters. There's a sort of depth of characterization, and those are the kinds of books that I return to often. I think the hard thing for me about nonfiction true crime is that I read a fair amount of it. I mean, it's something perhaps we can talk about, but there's a sense in which the birth of this genre was this kind of unholy, like when you look hard at In Cold Blood today, a lot of it's made up.
I don't consider it a true crime book. I always say it was a very good novel.
Yeah. I mean, it's a strange, the kind of lineage there is interesting, because I feel as though David or I today would be much more scrupulous about not inventing whole scenes.
Yes. When I went back and read it, a couple of years ago. In fact, I went back to read it when I was working on Kills the Father Man. I think there's a point where like they're in the head of the child who's being murdered, and I was just like, that's not knowable. And I do think when you ask the question is what's too far, I think the difference with nonfiction is there are gaps in knowledge, and the story doesn't always fit the conventions. And I think the challenge, it makes it really hard, but the puzzle is how to deal with that scrupulously and to acknowledge those doubts, to reveal those gaps, to make them part of the story, and to not kind of elide over the edges. Because we're not God, we're not fiction, we don't know everything.
Sometimes I think that part of the reason why you guys are attracted to the genre is less because you're interested in necessarily murder and mayhem or even breaking the law. It's that the genre of crime writing is more straightforwardly manipulative than some other forms of writing. And for somebody who is skilled at structure, which really good magazine writers have about thinking about how you plot a tale and how it unfolds, that kind of manipulation is sort of fair game and part of the delight of it. And like say David, when we worked on the piece about Cameron Todd Willingham, a man who was accused of having set his children on fire and was convicted on it and was sentenced to death, that piece is extremely manipulative. It makes you believe that he in fact did that and deserved it, and doesn't let you understand as a reader until well into the article that that entire perception of yours is wrong. And for me, that's a kind of whiplash that you experience that is both the pleasurable doubling back of a thriller, but it's actually a moral thing, because it leads you into making the moral mistake that people who defend the death penalty say they don't believe can happen, which is that you could falsely convict somebody who is innocent.
Yeah, and I think, for me, and it's a similar with structure when we talked a little bit about the Osage case, is that if you tell stories from the bottom up as opposed to from forward back, in other words, you don't tell them planting all the knowledge of what you know now. You begin the stories as they are unfolding, and therefore you are telling the story from the vantage point of all these people who convicted this man, and how the town and how the investigators, everyone came to this decision. You need to understand that you need to be complicit in it, and you need to understand it, because there was unanimity. That man was convicted and sentenced to die in less than an hour. And there was virtually nobody other than a few inner circle who believed he was innocent. So how do we get there? Well, you need to see it, how it happened at that time. And then you begin to see the deconstruction that happens over time. And so the whiplash, in a way, is embedded in the way the story actually unfolded. And it lets you experience it the way it happened, but it also challenges your assumptions, your perceptions, your confirmation biases. All these elements led to his conviction. And so you need to understand how that unfolded.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to
I would just say one other thing. It was a very unconventional story, because I don't think we'd ever done a story where, I don't remember how long that story was, but maybe 15,000 words. I don't remember. But, I think the first 6,000 or 7,000 words is just literally laying out the case of his conviction before it begins to unfold.
Exactly. Patrick, let's talk a little bit about how you settle on a story about crime. I mean, sometimes, you'll read about a case and it'll be like, finally the first, intercontinental serial killer has been, arrested or something. And, I get pitches like this all the time. And sometimes I'll be like, well, okay, that's a first of a sort, but like, is the piece just going to like lay out a lot of like, buzzsawing and hacking and awful ghastly stuff? It doesn't seem like it's very rich or complicated. It just seems like a kind of ghastly story. What kinds of crime stories interest you, Patrick? Is it ones where you find moral ambiguity? Or I also think with you, as somebody who kind of, as a narrator, is very kind of present as a kind of detective, relishing his role as a kind of uncoverer, that you sort of love stories in which you go in not sure what the answer to the crime is, and you are both the journalist, but also the detective.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, to your point about a story about a certain kind of crime not being enough, I feel that way as a reader. I mean, I often, and it's funny to go back to the idea of genre and the sort of the tricks of the trade. It's like you can take a police report and reconstruct a scene in a vivid way. I mean, there's a way to do that that's seductive, but I often feel with that kind of writing that they end up being, even really well-turned pieces can be sort of less than the sum of their parts, unless there's something more there, unless there's some reason we're engaging with it. And for me, often it's a question of a character and a person and why they did a certain thing. I mean, there was a piece I wrote for you about this guy who worked for Steve Cohen, the hedge fund manager, and the Preet Bharara in New York was trying to prosecute Steve Cohen, doing everything he could. And they'd found this guy who was clearly caught red-handed insider trading, and they expected the guy to flip. Matthew Martoma was his name, this young portfolio manager, and he wouldn't. And that was the question we went into it with. Why will this young guy not flip? Why will he go to prison rather than turn on Steve Cohen? And the answer was very surprising to me, and took me actually into his past and his family and his relationship with his wife and his parents in ways that were really, really interesting and surprising. But I didn't have any idea of that going in. Or to give you another example, I mean, there's an example I always think about, Daniel, which is that I wrote a piece years ago about this woman, Amy Bishop, who was a mass shooter who had shot a bunch of her colleagues in 2010 at the University of Alabama at Huntsville. And there was a novelty there. She'd gone to Harvard. She had just been denied tenure. She was a woman engaged in a mass shooting. And the story had been written about kind of on those terms. And there was this fascinating episode from Amy's past, which is that it turned out after this mass shooting that when she was quite young, just barely out of her teens, she had shot and killed her brother in Braintree, Massachusetts in the 1980s. And at the time, there was one witness to the shooting. It was their mother. There are only two children in this family, and the mother witnesses the daughter shoot the son with a shotgun. And when the police came, the mother said, "I saw the whole thing. It was an accident." And I remember us talking about that story and me saying, I don't know if I see it, and you saying, Amy Bishop isn't what's interesting about the story. She's always going to be a bit of a cipher, and there'll be no account that you can give for why she shot all her colleagues that will actually be all that penetrating. But her mother, back in the 80s, made this choice, and it was a moral choice, and also probably an instinctive human choice, and that should be the kind of locus of the inquiry of the piece. And so, they're not always that rich in terms of the theme that I'm exploring, but I think in the best circumstances, it's not just a police blotter, kind of tawdry story of crime. It's a question about people in extreme circumstances, making difficult decisions that reasonable people could argue about.
What was amazing about that story, it's one of my favorite stories of all time. But as a reporter, as a fellow reporter, one of the things that also is so important to these stories, to be honest, was that approach to the story is very compelling, but the challenges of getting people, the intimate people who were involved, to talk and open up to you in that story, the way you talk to the family, let the family, I mean, it was just so revealing, but it was also above everything else, just a masterpiece of reporting. Like that's one of those stories where Daniel come to me, I don't know, I would have said, well, I don't know if you can really ever tell that story. Because there are stories that come to you and you're like, the burdens, I don't know how I would ever get inside that story.
But David, you know this better than anyone, but I mean, they don't always work out. Sometimes you get a lucky break. And in that case, I was ready to quit. In that case, I didn't have either of the Bishop parents for months. Yeah. And then even after I had spoken to them, I hadn't spoken to Amy. And I think we were literally fact checking the piece at the point where I suddenly got this call from prison, and interviewed her. But I mean, I think that's to go back to what you were saying about how it's easy to look in retrospect, at the time it was terrifying. I didn't think I had the ingredients for a piece, but then, and this is in some ways one of the privileges and our good fortune for writing for the New Yorker is that you do have the time, right? That it's possible to say, I'll spend another couple of months, trying to get that elusive source to talk. And I'm very conscious that there's a premium on that sort of time, and it's fortunate to have it.
I just also add just one last thing, because since Daniel is here, kind of wonderfully navigating this conversation, but we often think of reporters as these kind of lone wolves who are just kind of out there doing their thing, but stories like this where you're dealing with crimes, where you're dealing with these moral issues, these very fraught issues, questions of reporting come out, questions of whether this is the right story. The relationship with an editor like Daniel or we have actually the same book editor too, Bill Thomas at Doubleday. These relationships are essential to the process and guiding you. You do a lot of the reporting on your own, but you really can get lost and you can make mistakes unless you have somebody to bounce things off of you, or to have like someone say, no, keep going back. I remember working on the Willingham story. Daniel said, you have to try to track down the wife. And I literally went to Texas, and, I remember just camping out for days, just being pushed to close, the cross anything that can be found. It doesn't mean you get it all, but at least you've tried. And you often need that person to push you to say, oh no, this is the hole in your story and you got to go fill it. And that usually means, when there's a hole, it's because there's a weakness in your reporting and you need to go back and revisit it.
Patrick, when you were saying that, part of the pleasure of kind of taking your time with these stories is that you can kind of, think about the proper structure and the way in. I think people who are, interested in the form would like to know, do you guys always, create an outline or some sort of, structure in advance before you actually start writing set pieces and, actual paragraphs? Or do you, does it depend on the piece? There are people who think that outlines deaden prose, but other people sometimes think that, if you're going to actually construct something that is intricate, and that has interlocked elements that are going to pay off, that you actually do have to think it through.
Yeah, I mean, I just speaking for myself, I could not possibly write even a relatively short piece without an outline. I know there are people who are able to do it, and I marvel at their ability to just kind of arrange extemporaneously. Everything is structure for me, and I mean, I say that, and you know, this will be interesting only to people who do this kind of writing for a living. But I found at a certain point it's useful not just in organizing the story, but also as an organizing principle for the reporting. So, you know, when David was talking about that idea that you can keep going back and keep going back, I always think of reporting as like 0.9999999 getting closer and closer to 1, and you never quite get there. You know, there's always more you could do. And the danger of that for me is that I'll just report forever. I won't write. And the reporting will endlessly proliferate and branch outward. And so what I end up doing often is earlier and earlier in the process, I'll just sit down and do a kind of back of the envelope. What are the big beats here? Whether it's a book or a piece, you know, what are the big kind of turns? What are the big moments? And just lay them out. And that's, you know, it never stays that way, but it's an organizing principle. And then that kind of grows usually into quite a detailed outline. And then I write into the outline. But the utility of that for me in the reporting is that it's this wonderfully liberating moment where, you know, once you have that in your reporting, you come across some amazing story or some wild character who seem intrinsically really appealing, and you know, and a week before you might have said, God, should I find some way to work them in? But then you have your map and you say, well, that's fascinating, but it's ultimately a digression. This is the story I'm telling. And again, it's a sort of loose notion. It's not a hard and fast rule, but I think I would go mad if I didn't have that. I'd certainly never finish a piece or a book.
Yeah, I couldn't work without outlines, and I do a similar kind of sketch outline of the beats and certain sections when you kind of start, especially, you know, you have some sense of where you're going to go, and you kind of set up certain kind of loose guidelines. It's almost like I consider it almost a sketch outline. It may only be, you know, 500 words, just kind of with the areas you want to go and some kind of chronology. But then, you know, then I work on the outlines for each section. This may be mundane for people who aren't writers, but you do it partly just as as you said, an organizing principle. And unlike, I don't know if you could see, but it's got a very nice, neat bookshelves, but my book and on the floor and God knows where else. And so if I don't create those outlines, I can't find the material when I need it. I'll be like, where was that fact, or where was that quote? And so for me, I create for each section these very long outlines that are really almost repositories of information. I can key search a word, and I can just find it, so that when I'm writing a scene, I'm not literally going back and being interrupted every 2 minutes. So I too would be completely lost. And some of my outlines are too long, but I would be lost without them.
Given that you guys are such, you know, obsessive reporters, and more than once have actually, you know, pretty much solved cases that have eluded even official authorities, how do you learn to live sometimes when you're working on a story and mysteries remain? You know, when do you know, like, I have to stop? You know, I'm telling the story of crime, and I want to be the detective who just, you know, gets every single detail exposed, but reality just forbids you from doing that. You know, how hard do you bump against the wall, and how do you try to make a virtue of the mysterious?
Patrick?
I'm just laughing because I just spent a year making an 8-part podcast about unsolvable mysteries, and it's basically like 6 hours of the sound of me bumping my head against a wall. I'd encourage people to listen to it. Yeah, it's hard. I mean, it's really hard. The Wind of Change, this podcast, was something where there was a incredibly tantalizing mystery that I heard about 9 years ago, and I couldn't shake it. I just couldn't. I kept trying to just put it in the outbox, the kind of emotional outbox. and it wouldn't stay there. And I had to find a way to address it. And so I did it in a podcast. Unfortunately, a podcast is, I think, in some ways more accommodating than a magazine article is to that sort of, it's almost like a ride along. I'm kind of taking you with me as I go down these strange rabbit holes and you know, these blind alleys and so forth. But it's hard. For me, I'm sure David has the same thing. You know, there are certain stories, for reasons I've never entirely understood. I think that if you write an 8,000 word magazine article and it's a mystery, and at the end you throw up your hands and say, and we'll never know, I think there's a pretty strong tendency for a lot of readers to say, give me my hour back.
Yeah.
And which is interesting, because I think that's not true. It might seem self-serving for me to say it at the moment. I think it's not true with podcasting for whatever reason. I think it's not necessarily true even with documentary, but with magazines, I think you need some sense of conclusion. And so what that means for me is I have this huge list of really intriguing stories that over the years I've mentioned to you, and then I've gone and kicked the tires on. And for one reason or another, I've been unable to wrap up or to complete or to find a way to write a story that has an ending. Yeah. And it's painful, but I think it's just, to me, it's just one of the kind of features of this genre, is that generally that's a story these days that I probably won't end up writing.
Yeah, you know, I think of that, one of the early stories I did for the New Yorker with Daniel was the story about, which you mentioned in your introduction, about the world's greatest Sherlock Holmes scholar who was found garroted in mysterious circumstances. And I kind of went on this path and, you know, spent a long time investigating it. And I think the preponderance of the evidence, to use a kind of Sherlockian phrase, pointed in the direction of what had happened. But, you know, none of us are Sherlock Holmes as reporters. You know, we're all Watson stumbling around blind, trying to make sense of things, not being able to answer every question. I remember his sister, the Sherlock Holmes scholar sister, said to me, you know, we have to learn to live with doubt. And that has always stayed with me as a reporter and as a writer, to recognize that there is some doubt. And then to your question, Daniel, you kind of report when you've kind of realized you've gone as far as you can, and there's really no other doors to open. There are pieces you might not know, but you realize, you know, you won't get it. And you know, usually with the magazine stories, it's usually small bits. You kind of answered all the large questions. I'll say the one time where it was a real challenge for me was with Killers of the Flower Moon, because once I realized the scope of these crimes, and I realized there were so many of these other unsolved murders, I began to look into those cases. But so many of the witnesses were dead. They were all dead for the most part. The victims were dead. The suspects were dead. The evidence had been purposely covered up. You know, in some of the cases, I could get circumstantial evidence to reveal and point to a killer, but in many of the cases, it really was impossible. And I remember originally thinking, how am I going to do this? Like, how am I going to tell a story in a book that has all this lack of resolution that I am not capable, you know, for all my efforts to resolve? And I kept banging my head, and then I realized that doubt was part of the horror. That lack of resolution was actually what made these crimes so sinister, because the perpetrators were not only covering up these crimes and erasing the lives of these victims, they were in many ways erasing their history. And so I took that doubt and I actually made it kind of the central theme of the book, and kind of to reckon with, because for me, it revealed and got to the truth and the deeper horror of these stories. And so I always think of reporting as, you have a conception in your mind because we read things or something, but the reporting takes you in different places and you have to reckon with that and deal with it. It's often really hard at first, but it usually deepens the story because it's the true story.
Mm-hmm. Let me talk a little bit about you guys as prose stylists, as writers. Crime fiction often is associated with, you know, with the hard-boiled tone of a certain kind of, you know, license to be a bit portentous or even a little bit purple. And, you know, writers can play with that, and you can play with it well, or you can play with it badly. But, how do you guys think about, the way that you write a sentence or, construct a paragraph in a true crime tale? And do you want the reader to be aware of the sort of fictional genre counterpart that it's connected to? Or do you deliberately try to kind of, sever the ties between the kind of Raymond Chandler or Tana French kind of fiction that many of your readers really love?
Yeah, I think it's hard. I mean, I don't, a few things. I mean, one is that I generally, the first thing I want to do is subvert your expectations. So if there is a story that seems to lean into a certain type of genre convention, then I wouldn't want to, I would want to upend the a good example would be the I wrote this piece, The Hunt for El Chapo, about when the second time Chapo was captured, before his escape and recapture, in 2014. And if you remember that piece, I was looking for something and I found it, in that there was a guy who actually just incidentally was just killed in Mexico, a hitman who worked for Chapo called El Chino Antrax. He had this amazing name.
I remember him.
And pour one out. And so El Chino, who was killed last week, had flown to Amsterdam. And I started that piece with El Chino walking into Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam. And it was partially because it ends up being a tendril that leads to the tip that gives them the information they need to target Chapo. But the main thing for me was that I literally thought, when people think about Chapo Guzman and the Sinaloa drug cartel, they immediately have a like set design picture in their mind. And the first thing I want to do is just put you someplace entirely different and show you that, in fact, particularly for this younger generation of narcos, they lived a very different type of life, and they were all on Instagram, and they went and hung out and partied in Paris. And it's not the kind of south of the border, sun rippling imagery. And so I'm often trying to find things like that. I mean, I guess the one other thing I would say is that and this was true in that piece and in a lot of the pieces I've done, the tricky thing for me with the genre conventions is that most of those tropes, I think, whether they're glamorizing or they're kind of titillating, I think that they tend to kind of elide the seriousness of the human cost. And so for me, the trick, and it is a bit of a trick, is can you play with those tropes in a way that is fun and makes it interesting and acknowledges that it actually, to be in the Sinaloa cartel at times is a fun, rollicking ride. To like join the IRA in the 1970s actually has a certain kind of glamour and righteous fervor associated with it. Can you do that without losing sight of the fact that there's tremendous, awful human cost? And to me, that's always the struggle. Is there a way to capture both the gravity in terms of loss of life, but also from the point of view of the people who are in it, the thrill at times of a prison break or whatever the moment is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I always think that each kind of piece has its own voice that you try to find that kind of fits the material. It's kind of true to it. But I do think generally, and since we're talking about crimes, that's when I tend to be most minimalistic and restrained. I think for the very reasons that Patrick said, I think often you want to be vivid always in your writing because you want to let the reader smell and hear and see and feel what is happening as if they were there, based on the facts. but you really want the facts, I think, in true crime stories, at least I do, to tend to speak for themselves. And the story is, being too intrusive about my own voice, I think would take away from the seriousness about what you're writing and just kind of get in the way to some degree. So it doesn't mean you don't have a voice, and you're not trying to have a voice, and you're not trying to be vivid and evocative, because you are, and you are telling a story. There's no two ways around it. But I tend to be very deferential to the facts in those kind of stories because of the gravity of them. Absolutely. And you don't want to be exploitive. You really don't. I mean, they get, you're writing about true crime. It's often gory, and you need to show what happened. But and so often I'll write things, and probably I am too graphic at first, and then you pare it back, and you get to enough so that the reader can see what happened, but you're not just wallowing in some gory detail that was in some police report that is really exploitive at some.
I also think, David, in terms of the kind of reporting that I do, and certainly that you do, that if you spend any time with somebody who's lost a child or lost a parent to violence, or witnessed real violence, it's pretty chastening. I mean, I think if you actually do the reporting and you go out and you speak to the people who have been affected in a permanent way, it gets pretty hard to be too exploitative in the way you write about it, because they're going to be reading it.
Yeah, and it's true even with the families of the murderers. I mean, you meet them, and I think that's very true.
As people who struggle to tell these crime stories in a cunning way, there's a tremendous satisfaction when you finally figure out either a key piece of information, or you figured out a way to tell a particular passage in your story in a way that is shocking or surprising. And that must be incredibly fun to write. So I wanted to ask you guys, what is the greatest single moment of being thrilled with something that you had put on the page was? When was there a moment when you feel like, I solved this thing myself? I couldn't figure out how to do this, but finally in this book or in this story, I solved this problem that had eluded me for a long time.
After you, David.
Wow. Well, I would say I find that reportings are always journeys, and there are always moments of revelation. I begin many stories very skeptically. I mean, for example, the Willingham story about this man who was accused of setting a fire that killed his 3 children, and he was put to death for. I remember, when I spoke to his own defense attorney and said, "Oh, he did it. He's guilty." I said, "Well, he must be guilty." His own defense attorney said so. And I always begin very skeptically, and then you begin to gather the evidence. And so sometimes the revelation is in a weird way isn't a thrill. It's almost, people always say reporters are cynical, and I'm really the opposite. I'm always shocked when I find what people did or the mistakes people made and the blunders. And so, for example, the Willingham case is more and more evidence, piled up, and it just became, unbelievably clear that he was wrongfully convicted, and the overwhelming evidence indicates he was innocent, and he was put to death. You kind of gasp. And I'll just give one other example of that in Killers of the Flower Moon. And this also gets to what Patrick had just mentioned earlier, when you deal with real people, which is what does separate this from fiction to some degree. And I remember there was a case that had not been resolved of a lawyer who had investigated some of the Osage murders and was thrown off a speeding train. And it had never been solved. And I met with his grandchildren's descendants, and they had given me little files about this haunting crime that continued to haunt them. They gave me what clues they had, and I began to look into that case. And it was one of the rare instances where the circumstantial evidence became really clear the more I dug into it, who was responsible. And I remember calling up one of the descendants who had given me the file that they had had over the years. And I remember having a month before, I can't quite describe it, but I had some sense of accomplishment because I thought, oh my God, I think I figured this out. And the evidence, I really do think I know who did this. And I remember calling her to tell her, and she began to cry. And initially I felt so bad. And then I thought, I said, I'm so sorry. And there was a part of me which said, well, maybe I just shouldn't have even mentioned this to her. And then she just said to me, she said, no, it's okay. But we've been living with this for so long. And it's just a reminder in these real cases that the discoveries often have real consequences. And you're reminded of that. And you're reminded of that trauma that these cases inflict upon the people involved, often decades or nearly a century after the actual crime took place.
Wow. Yeah, I had very much the same experience for me. Hands down, the experience like that for me that was most profound was sitting in my home office a few years ago and making this discovery, looking at an old transcript of an unpublished interview and suddenly figuring out who it was that had murdered Jean McConville, this mother of 10 back in 1972. And I had the same thing, David, where it's almost as though there's, you have two selves. The reporter in me was like pumping my fist in the air and whooping, as if I'd like just won a basketball game or something. But then almost immediately the gravity of it kind of punches you in the gut, and you realize the person I'm going to accuse is still alive. They've never been accused. They have a family. Does the family know? How about the children of Jean McConville? They've never known. I have to tell them. So it is this, I sometimes find that my mind is a little bit split. The reporter in me thinks of these moments as unalloyed triumphs. But the human who's tries to be compassionate, is often sort of stopped short in those moments, just thinking about the consequences.
Good. We're almost out of time, but I just wanted to, let's think about, having spoken about, how many things need to be calibrated just right to make a piece of kind of crime writing satisfying and rich and not exploitative. Who are some writers who you feel have gotten it right? Like you guys slagged Truman Capote a bit, but like who are some people who are writing today who've either written books or articles that are about crime, but that you think are not just exciting to read, but actual sort of major works of nonfiction?
Oh boy, I mean Pam Coliff.
Mm-hmm.
And with her, she's also been doing it for so long, and in kind of pursuing certain themes in ways that I think are. Earlier on in the conversation, I was talking about that idea of sort of how do you tell a systemic story? How do you tell a bigger story through a specific human experience? And I think she does that brilliantly. Let's think of others.
David?
How about you, David?
Well, I would certainly echo Pamela Coliff. She's remarkable and has that kind of sensitivity and the sense of the larger. She's always writing about the kind of larger themes and implications and getting at the systems and the flaws and the bias. So she's really using crime to expose something larger about society, which I think is so interesting. So many of my colleagues at the New Yorker, not to slag for them, but Patrick, his book Saying Nothing, his pieces in the New Yorker, Lawrence Wright, I could go on. And then, as I've written more about history in a lot of my books, the suspicions of, I think it was Suspicions of Mr. Wincher, I'm probably butchering the title, read a while back. And I look at people like Eric Larson, who's able to kind of write about history and the devil in the White City and do these reconstructions. And you're always looking for models. I am always looking for models. And so whatever I'm writing about, I literally go to books that I think will help me and teach me. They're often the best instructors. So I look at different books depending on kind of the subjects I'm writing about. But certainly as I deal with more history, I really look at people like Eric Larson and kind of how they're doing it.
Excellent. Well, thanks, guys. I think Richard is going to join us and kind of help end the session. Thank you guys very much.
Thank you so much, Daniel.
Thank you all so much, and thank you all out there. You gave me, I put on a shirt for a button shirt for the first time in months, and you gave me some virtual sense of normalcy. And I haven't seen my colleagues in 2 months, so it's so nice to have done this.
Yeah. Thanks so much to everyone for joining tonight. Thank you to the authors and the moderator, and of course the audience. It was a great conversation. So our next virtual event in this Two Writers Talking series presented by Doubleday is happening on Wednesday, June 3rd. You should be seeing it on your screen. And we'll also drop a link in the chat, and we'll also send it in a follow-up email. And that upcoming event is going to be with best-selling authors Candice Millard, author of Hero of the Empire, and Hampton Sides, author of On Desperate Ground. And they'll be talking about the art of writing historical narrative nonfiction. It'll be great. So everyone stay safe, keep reading, and have a good night. Bye.
Thanks all.